Yesterday, May 19th, I issued a letter to the New England Synod strongly recommending that we not hold in-person worship services until at least July 1st. In this video, I want to go into some detail as to why I issued that letter and the background. First off, a disclaimer. I'm not a doctor. I'm not an expert. I'm going to leave all of that to the CDC and those people that know and understand what's happening. I'm also not a legal expert. I'm your bishop. And I'm making these decisions and these strong recommendations out of a deep concern for the well-being of all of our congregations, all of our members, and all of our pastors and deacons. Which leads me to the second thing I want to say at the beginning. I understand how difficult this is, and I also understand that for some of you, there is deep desire to go back to worship, to gather with people that you know and love and care for, to be in communion and community with one another. I get that. I know that that is a deep desire, especially for some of you who are at home, alone. And, yes, you can connect with people over the telephone or over the computer, but it's not the same. So I understand that longing. What I want to lay out for you in this video is some background and then 5 things I'd like you and your congregation to think about as you start to look at what could so-called reopening look like. So why yesterday, May 19th, did I issue that letter? Here's the backstory. The governors in 2 of our states, you got to remember, the New England Synod, we've got 6 states plus a couple of counties in upstate New York we've got to pay attention to. You and your congregation, you need to pay attention to your state where you're located. But as we look at the New England Synod as a whole, there are multiple states and 2 governors from those states this past weekend, Massachusetts and Rhode Island in particular, announced that as a part of their reopening plans, quote, houses of worship could begin on, and then they stated a date. When that was released, all people saw was the headline, either in the newspaper, online, or maybe in a radio or television report. It seemed to give the impression that the doors were open. Come on in. It's back to normal, back to what I call the January church. That's the church that was life in January, which now seems like about 4 centuries ago. That's not what the governors were saying, and we needed time to figure out what does this mean. Now, I had anticipated being a part of those conversations that would design those criteria, if you will, not only myself, but many others in the religious community, and quite candidly, the governors caught us all off guard. Having said that, I think our governors are doing a very fine job here in New England. But on this matter, we needed to say, okay, whoop, hit the pause button before we jump into anything. Let's give everybody a chance to look at this and to think about it. What I want to lay out for you now are 5 things, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, for you to talk about and think about. Now, let me be clear. This is not to replace all of the guidelines and all of the documents that have been released, both by the government in your state and by the ELCA, its documentation, as well as the Centers for Disease Control. I am being overly cautious. If you're perceiving that, you're reading me right. Why am I being cautious? It is because I care about the people of this synod. I care about the pastors and deacons as they lead. I care about the members of our congregations. So that's the backstory. And also, quite candidly, I don't want to see any of our congregations show up on a CNN news coverage for a disaster. So yes, if you think, oh, he's being cautious, you're right. Okay, so let's get to the 5 things you need to look at. Number 1, 6 feet apart. You're going to have to think about how you're going to navigate that. If we are to be 6 feet apart, what does that mean? Does that mean you have pews marked off? And what does that mean for Mrs. Johnson, who has that seat in that pew and has had it for a very long time? You know what I'm talking about. And then in the pew right in front of her is Mr. Gonzalez. And he always sits there. Well, that's not 6 feet apart, because you've got to think about 6 feet away from each other. You also need to think about 6 feet apart as people enter the building and as they leave the building. Now remember, this is primarily an aerosol-borne virus. That means that it is the air that we breathe. 6 feet apart. How are you going to navigate 6 feet apart for every single person all the time? Spend time, and if you need to stop this video right now and figure that out, because that is really important. All right? Number 2. I'm counting European, by the way. So 1, 2. Singing and speaking. Right now, even as I am speaking, and I'm trying to speak with some boldness and courage, and I'm using all of the air that is in my lungs, and I'm expelling a lot of verbosity. You may think, get to the point, Bishop. But right now, in this room, I am filling this room with air particles. If I am contagious with the coronavirus, this room has it all. The same is going to be true in a space. Inside, singing, we know from numerous studies, is at least, if not worse, than coughing. Why? Because we breathe in and then we sing. And Lutherans love to sing, but when we sing, we are putting out into the atmosphere all around us. Some studies even suggest beyond 6 feet. So does that mean that inside, in-person worship cannot have singing? I'm thinking that that is what it means. Because if you're going to put people in a contained space and they're going to breathe and sing, or the pastor is going to speak from the pulpit, even though he or she may be far up there, because we all know Lutherans like to sit way in the back. But still, what is that going to mean? So, how are you going to navigate that one? Number 3, greeting, sharing the peace, shaking hands, hugging, kissing. Can't do that. That's part of the January church. Now, I'm hoping that there will come a time down the road when we can get back to that. But right now, we cannot do that. So, there's no touching one another. Okay, so let's set the stage where we are in 1, 2, and 3. We're at least 6 feet apart, all the way from entering from the parking lot in through whatever your entryway is, through the narthex, sacristy. Do you come in the back door, the side door? How are you going to navigate that? Then we're inside, we're together, we can't sing, and public speaking needs to be also on our minds because it's an aerosol-borne illness. That's how it's transferred to people primarily, other ways as well. The other way is, number 3, there's no touching. So we're not touching, we're not singing, and we're staying at least 6 feet away from each other. That's what we're talking about as a minimum. How are you going to navigate all that? Who's going to enforce that? What kind of a dynamic is that going to create when now you're going to have ushers with masks telling people, no, stay far apart? Or how are you going to navigate that in a sanctuary setting when people are with one another and somebody is just so excited to see somebody that they've missed for months and they move closer? What kind of a dynamic is going to be created there? A little bit of tension. Whoa, hold off. We've all had this experience, even in grocery stores. Now we're going to have it with our comrades in a church setting. That's a difficult dynamic to navigate. Number four. Now we're really getting to the sacraments. No food, no coffee hour. No Mrs. Lee's best rice cake. No lutefisk. Well, that's probably a good thing. There's no coffee hour. There's no gathering for a meal or a food, negotiated conversation, coffee hour, in person. You can't do that. That's really clear and 100% across all of the guidelines. Number 5. Who's going to come? Now, here's what I mean by that. If we do hold an indoor, in-person worship service, and we've covered and we've made all of the plans for 1, 2, 3, 4, who's going to come? Now, some guidelines I've seen have said people over 65 should not come. Look, the reality is, who are most of the people that come to our worship services on a Sunday morning in our New England Synod congregations? It's people over 65. Now, the governors are saying they shouldn't come. Here's what I know. I know Yolanda. She's a member of my congregation when I served in Brooklyn, New York. If I told her, we're having worship, but you can't come, she's going to say, okay, Pastor. And guess what? She's going to come anyway. She's going to come anyway because A, she's a faithful Christian. B, she's been cooped up for a long time. And C, worship, if it happens, is a part of her life. It is the ritual with which she goes about her life. What are you going to do when she shows up? She's 85 years old. Now, maybe in your congregation, her name is not Yolanda. Maybe it's Betty. Maybe it's Pamela. Maybe it's George. Maybe it's Juan. I don't know what his or her name is, but we all have people in our congregations. They're going to come anyway. That's their right, R-I-G-H-T, to be a part of the rite, R-I-T-E, of worship. And how are you going to talk with their kids? They're 60-some-year-old kids who are saying, why are you letting mom, dad go to worship? Well, we're discouraging her. So how do you navigate that whole thing? So look, these are 5 things that I've laid out for you that you have to think through as you make your plans going forward. I've got to say, I've got great reticence around in-person, indoor worship. Just these 5 things that I've laid out for you, I'm trying to figure out, how are we going to navigate this? Now, I recognize there is no perfect solution. And I recognize, as I said at the beginning, there's deep desire to hold worship, in-person worship. I get that. Whenever we make a choice, there's always risk involved. Even before this whole thing happened. In the wintertime, you had to make a decision as to whether or not your church was going to be open during an ice storm or a snowstorm. And sometimes it was pretty clear and obvious, no, we're not meeting this Sunday. This is too big and too dangerous. And at other times it was like, well, it's a hard call, and okay, you decide we're going to go ahead. There's still always the risk that someone's going to come, they're going to park in your parking lot, they're going to walk across some snow, hit an ice patch, and slip, fall, break a hip. That's always a risk. So no matter what we do, there's risk involved. But let's be intentional and thoughtful and wise and faithful about our decisions that we make. So I want to conclude by saying, what's the upside with indoor, in-person worship? That's what I want you to spend the next 6 weeks talking about and thinking about. be mindful of the impact of your decisions as you go forward. So now, I'm putting together a series of these videos because they seem to be helpful. I'll continue to write letters. That's one form of communication, but it has its limitations. Here I can be a little bit more myself, and I can also kind of reflect with you, and maybe the nuance of the whole dilemma can come forward. So the next video that I'm going to present for you next week will be on Holy Communion. You may know we're in the middle of this synod-wide conversation, and I'll present some things for you to think about, both theologically and practically, as we go forward and try to navigate these times. God bless you, your ministry. I'm so grateful for all that you're doing. You are rising to the occasion on so many levels. It's an honor to be in this position of leading you during these days.